Hello everyone. So I know I've been talking for a few months now about doing this series on the fairy ballads. Some real life chaos has gotten in the way, so it's taken a little longer than I intended to get to it. But I am planning to do the first one probably next week or early September. Before I do that though, I wanted to do this video, sort of a preparation or primer before we get into the fairy ballad material, sort of cover some of the basics of what the fairy ballad material is, so that when we start I won't have to go over this in every single video. So basically I'm going to be doing a series of videos, probably 6 or 7. Each one is going to look at a particular fairy related ballad that we have, and these would be English and Scottish material. The ballad material is actually really broad. We have quite a lot of it. Not all of it, not most of it actually, touches on or mentions fairies in any way. We're going to be focusing, because obviously the point of this YouTube channel, we're going to be focusing on the ones that do mention fairies and do touch on them, and particularly the ones where fairies are sort of the main feature or point of the ballad. It's important to understand with the ballad material that first of all, these are often passed down today now in written form. You can find them in books, and I'll be going over at the end some of the books that I'm using as sources. However, this material was never intended to be passed on in that form. It's not intended to be read. It's not intended to be studied that way. These are songs. This is material that is meant to be sung. It's meant to be heard. I highly encourage everyone who's following these videos and who's interested in this subject, when we're talking about any specific ballad, to go and find different versions of that ballad, and you can find them. There are still performances of them out there, and actually listen to them, because that's how they are intended to be consumed, to be taken in. And it really does make a difference, and not just for people who maybe learn better from hearing things than from reading things, but it really makes a difference hearing them sung, hearing them performed, as opposed to just reading them. So definitely really encourage that. And I will try at the beginning of each of the specific videos to mention some good versions, or versions that I like or recommend that people can look for. Quite a few of them are on YouTube, so it should be fairly convenient for people. So that's sort of the first point. The second point, which ties into that one, is that this material is what I would refer to as living, evolving, growing cultural material. So yes, we can look back, and I will look back at the oldest versions and sort of trace back where we see them historically, kind of the first written versions that we have, the first records of them that we have. And in a lot of cases that goes back hundreds of years. With Thomas the Rhymer, it was originally, it's now a ballad, but it was originally prose, and that goes back to the 16th century. But all of this changes and evolves. We have versions that might date back, 300-400 years, but then there's also many, many versions up through today. And many of these ballads have then further been taken into fiction and turned into even urban fantasy in some cases. So these continue to evolve, and these evolutions can also tell us a lot about the material, sometimes good, sometimes bad. And these evolutions also, in some cases, give us sort of a fascinating insight into the way that the understanding of the fairy material was changing over time. And even in some cases, the way that the fairy material sort of fell out of fashion over time. So one of the ballads that we're going to be discussing is the Elfin Knight. It's my personal favorite. I love it. There's some great versions of it out there. Most people, though, are not familiar with it. They haven't heard of it. They haven't heard it. However, the Elfin Knight is the original basis for Scarborough Affair. And Scarborough Affair, of course, is something that many people are more familiar with. It's fairly popular Simon and Garfunkel did a version. There's been many other versions since then. So a lot of people have heard of Scarborough Affair, which of course does not have any overt fairy lore or fairies in it, but comes ultimately from this source of the Ballad of the Elfin Knight, which is all about fairies and fairy lore. So we do see things like that, which again can give us some really interesting insight into how these changed with the times, so to speak. So these are all things that it's important to sort of keep in mind as we're discussing the individual particular ballads. And also, I would like to say, it goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway, with many of these, there is really no one definitive version. Like there is no ultimate original accurate version of the Ballad of Tan Lin, for example. We have the oldest recorded version, but then we have multiple other versions and variations. A lot of these, because they were songs and they were performed, you'll have regional variations. And this is all good and very useful for our purposes. Just important to keep in mind that it's not like there's one ultimate true source for these things. It is important to understand that timeline and that evolution, and that, you know, a version of, say, you know, True Thomas that was written or created in the 20th century is going to tell us different things than a version from the 17th century, and that we shouldn't confuse two for various reasons. The same way that the novelizations of these things, while they're very useful and also often very entertaining, you know, they shouldn't be confused with like the true or accurate version, if that makes sense to everyone. There's less of like an ultimate one true ballad that we'll be looking at. We'll be looking at sort of all of these different versions that are out there and kind of comparing them. And, you know, sometimes one would have particular information in it that another one would not have. Sometimes we'll even see a character in one version that's explicitly a fairy, and in another version is human. So that's interesting too, to kind of look at that and why that might be. So that is sort of a really super quick crash course, if you will, in what the ballad material is and kind of some things to keep in mind as we're going forward. I did also want to quickly touch on here the sources I'm going to be using in case anyone else is curious about them, might want to look into them themselves, anything like that. So I do use Wimberley's Folklore in the English and Scottish Ballads. This one is particularly good for analysis. It talks a lot about themes and different things that we see in the ballads, more than directly talking about the ballads themselves. There are plenty of sources for the ballads themselves, though. So, for example, we have this one, Ancient Ballads and Songs of the North of Scotland. This one is good for some of the more obscure material that we might get into. The main source that you're going to find a lot of people, a lot of websites use is Child, Francis James Child. He has a series of texts that are collections of ballad material. The English and Scottish Popular Ballads, Volume 1 is the main one I use because that has the majority of the fairy ballads in it. There's also a really good website called tam-lin.org, which includes quite a selection of the different ballad material. This one, of course, the cover is much less interesting. This is Crawford's collection, number 2. Again, just a collection of some of this ballad material. See if I can hold this one up. This is the Romance and Prophecies of Thomas of Ercildoune. My only caveat for people with this one, if you're interested in getting it, is that because this dates back as I had said, to the 17th century, the language in it might be a little difficult for some readers if you're not familiar with early modern English and Scots, because it is not modern English. So just something to keep in mind. This one, again, not a particularly exciting cover, and I'm sorry because this is an older book. The binding on the side is not doing well. The spine has issues. But this is Jameson's Ballads, and again, Scottish lowland ballads. And then finally, Sir Walter Scott, Minstrelsy of the Scottish Border. So the main reason I have all of those different books that are all basically titled Ballads, English and Scottish Ballads, is because they contain these different versions. And it is sort of important to look at the different versions and compare them, and all sorts of things that are probably really tedious to a lot of people. I enjoy them. So when we're talking about the individual ballads, I will be talking about comparing, you know, Jameson's version to Scott's version to Child's version, that sort of a thing. And sort of what different things we see between the different versions. And of course, getting into talking about what we can learn from them, what it tells us to look at the fairy lore and the beliefs that we find in all of these different ballads. So as of right now, my plan is to do Thomas the Rhymer, Tam Lin, the Elfin Knight, Lady Isabel and the Elf Knight, the Elfin Queen's Nerys, and probably the Fairy Oak of Coreywater as well. That'll give us 7, which is a good amount of material to cover. I'll do a separate video for each of them because it is going to be a lot to dig into in some cases, particularly with the first 4 ballads that I mentioned there. And these videos are going to vary in length. I would expect the Thomas the Rhymer and Tam Lin one in particular are going to go probably 45 minutes to an hour, because there's just a lot to unpack in those. Some of the others, Fairy Oak of Coreywater, might go a little shorter. We'll have to wait and see. But that is my current plan. I am still doing this. I realize I have said that and then I haven't had time to make the actual videos yet. But I do have all my sources pulled together. I actually do have the material for the Thomas the Rhymer and the Tam Lin ones. They're coming out of course now I can't find a copy of it. They're coming out of my book, A New Dictionary of Fairies, because I have sort of these analysis essays in that book. So I'm going to kind of use that as a basic guide for what I talk about in the video. Then I have to get the material worked up for the other ones. I just have not had time with everything that's going on in my life in general to sit down to actually make the longer videos yet. But I am on schedule to do that. I should be able to do that in the next week or two. So expect the first video to be coming up fairly soon. I do encourage people, obviously if you've made it this far, you have watched this video, but I am going to encourage people to watch this video first, just because it covers all of those basics about the ballad material before we actually get into each of the individual ones. So I don't have to say all of these same things for each individual video. And I think that covers everything. If anyone has any questions, if anyone would like me to repeat any of the sources that I'm using, some of these books you might be better off trying to find like in a library. I'm not sure how difficult they would be to purchase, but they should be available. And like I said, tamlin.org, tam-lin.org. It's an excellent website for this. It has many versions of particularly Tam Lin, but it does also include some of the other ballad material, and it has several really good essays analyzing, again, particularly Tam Lin, but a really great resource you can find free online. And some of this material, like child's ballads, I believe you can also find a lot of those free online as well, if you look. So that's it for today. I will be back soon with the first video in the series, and hopefully this has covered all the basics of ballad material. Obviously, if you have any questions about anything I talked about here or about the ballads in general, please drop them in the comments and I will get to them as soon as I can. Thanks everyone. I'll see you again soon.